I'm Alex 32M, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the reliable one in my family. The person who always says yes. The one who gets called at the last minute for emergencies, favors, or anything inconvenient that no one else wants to handle. Need someone to watch the kids.
I'm there.
Short on rent? I'll lend the money. Car broke down? I'll drop what I'm doing to help. At least that's how it used to be. Because when I needed them, really needed them, they were always too busy, too tired, or just plain forgot. It took me way too long to realize how one-sided it all was. But the final straw? That was my housewarming party. Buying my first home was a huge deal for me. I worked my ass off to afford it, saved for years, made sacrifices. So when I finally got the keys, I wanted to celebrate. I planned everything, set a date, sent out invites weeks in advance, made sure it was convenient for everyone. My mom, my siblings, even my cousins, they all said they'd be there. The night comes, I have food, drinks, music, a few close friends arrive on time, and we're waiting for my family to show up. An hour passes. Then two. At some point, I check my phone. Nothing. I start sending texts. No one replies right away. My sister finally responds. Traffic's crazy, might not make it. Meanwhile, she's posting Instagram stories from a bar across town. My mom, I was just so tired today. I needed to rest. My brother, crap, I totally forgot. Next time for sure. My cousins didn't even bother responding. I just stood there, looking at the spread of food I had laid out, listening to my friends try to fill the silence, pretending they weren't just as pissed as I was. This wasn't just another missed gathering. This was supposed to be my moment, the culmination of years of sacrifice and effort. I had never asked for much, but for once, I wanted them to celebrate something important to me, and they couldn't be bothered. The worst part? I wasn't even surprised. I wish I could say this was a one-time thing, but it was just another moment in a long pattern. My sister, I took unpaid time off work to babysit her daughter when she had a last-minute work trip. She didn't even say thank you. My dad, he once called me during work hours to help him with something real quick. That something turned into a full day of me running errands for him. I missed a deadline. My cousin, I loaned him money when he was in a tight spot. He ghosted me for months. When I finally asked about it, he acted like I was the problem. And every time I tried to bring it up, the response was always the same. Family doesn't keep score. You should want to help. Why are you making such a big deal about this? I didn't realize how much resentment had been building up until that night. A few weeks later, my cousin sends a group message. Hey, everyone, wedding's happening in a few months. Can't wait to see you all. I never got a save the date or an invite. A couple of days later, my mom calls. You're going to your cousin's wedding, right? I tell her I wasn't invited. She laughs. Oh, I'm sure he just assumed you'd come. You should book your flight soon. Flights? The wedding was across the country, and it was happening on my birthday weekend. Then she drops the real bomb. Your sister and brother can't afford the trip, so maybe you could help cover their costs. I finally snap. I tell her no. No, I'm not flying across the country for a wedding I wasn't even invited to. No, I'm not paying for my siblings to go. No, I'm not doing this anymore. Cue the guilt trip. Wow, so you're really going to be like that? After everything we've done for you? Like what? Exactly. The family group chat explodes. Suddenly, I'm the selfish one. The ungrateful one. The one who's too focused on himself. My sister jumps in, saying how I'm abandoning them. My cousin, the same one who never paid me back, writes a paragraph about how family should always support each other. The irony, after years of being the one who always showed up, the second I say no, I'm the villain. And that's when it hit me. If I stopped reaching out, would any of them? I decided to find out. I made a choice that night. I wasn't going to reach out first anymore. No calls, no texts, no favors. If they wanted a relationship with me, they could make the effort. And if they didn't, well, that would tell me everything I needed to know. I stopped reaching out. No calls, no texts, no checking in. If they wanted a relationship with me, they'd have to show it. Days passed, then a week, then two. Silence. Not a single message from my mom, my siblings, or any of the cousins who had so much to say when I refused to fund their wedding trip. The family group chat that had exploded in outrage just weeks before, dead, it was like I had never existed. Then, the first emergency hit. My sister's babysitter canceled last minute. Normally she'd call me in a panic expecting me to drop everything and watch my niece. This time, the call came, and for the first time ever I let it ring. A few minutes later another call. Then a text. It's important. I ignored it. An hour later she posted on Facebook about finding a last-minute lifesaver to watch her kid. Someone else stepped up. Funny how that works. My birthday came next. I didn't expect a grand celebration, but a simple happy birthday from my family would have been nice. Nothing. Not even a lazy group text. Meanwhile, my cousin, the same one who wanted me to pay for his wedding trip, posted a series of photos from his over-the-top bachelor party. Expensive dinners, clubbing, bottle service, plenty of money for that apparently. I wouldn't have even realized how much time had passed if it weren't for my friends. They threw me a surprise birthday dinner. Good food, real conversation, actual effort. That night, I checked my phone again. Still nothing from my family. Then, a week later, my mom finally texted, not a check-in, not an apology, not even a simple, "Hey, how have you been?" Just, "Can you take your dad to his doctor's appointment on Tuesday?" A full month of silence, and the only reason she reached out was to ask for a favor. I replied, "I can't." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then finally, "Wow, so this is who you are now." A few days later, my sister called again. This time I picked up. She went straight into a rant. Apparently she had realized that I was ignoring the family, and she was done tiptoeing around my little tantrum. She didn't understand why I was being so cold, why I was acting like a stranger. I told her I wasn't acting like anything, I just wasn't bending over backward for people who only remembered me when they needed something. That set her off. She started yelling about how she was a single mom, how she couldn't do everything alone, how family is supposed to be there. When I reminded her that I had a birthday recently, she got quiet for a second. Then she scoffed and said, "I didn't realize I had to schedule a reminder for that." I hung up. 2 days later, the cousin's wedding drama started. Apparently, everything was falling apart. The venue had hidden fees. The caterer backed out last minute, and now they were scrambling for money. Suddenly, the same family members who ignored my birthday were tagging me in group messages. Someone suggested everyone pitch in a little extra to make sure the wedding wasn't ruined. I left the group chat. That sent them into a frenzy. One by one, the texts started coming in. My cousin said I was being heartless. My aunt, who I hadn't spoken to in months, asked if something was going on with me. My mom sent a message so long it had to be broken into 3 separate texts, ranting about how I was alienating the family and how grandma would be so disappointed if she were alive to see this. Then something unexpected happened. Another aunt, one I'd always gotten along with but never talked to much, sent me a private message. She told me she saw what was happening, and she understood. She even admitted that she had thought about stepping in earlier, but didn't want to go against the family. It made me wonder how many others saw the truth but were too afraid to say anything. She had been through something similar when she was younger, said she wished she had stood her ground the way I was doing now. I stared at her message for a long time. That was the first moment I felt doubt creeping in. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I was blowing things out of proportion. But then I remembered every time I had shown up for them. Every time I had sacrificed my time, my money, my energy, and how, when it was my turn to need something as simple as basic respect, they had nothing to give. A coworker noticed I seemed distracted and asked what was up. I gave him the short version, expecting the usual family is family speech. Instead, he nodded and told me I should talk to a therapist. I booked an appointment the next day. Then something even weirder happened. My dad called. He never called. When I picked up, there was an awkward pause before he finally said, "Your mom's upset. Can't you just fix things?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I miss you." Just another request to make life easier for everyone else. I told him I wasn't mad. I was just done. That's when I decided, no more bending. No more guilt. If they didn't show up for me, I wasn't showing up for them. No exceptions. The passive-aggressive posts started almost immediately. My mom, who rarely posted anything on Facebook, suddenly had a lot to say. Vague status updates about certain people forgetting the meaning of family. My sister liked every single one. A few of my cousins chimed in with comments like, "So sad when people change and some people need to remember who was there for them." None of them mentioned my name, but it was obvious. A few mutual friends even messaged me, asking if I was okay because apparently, my family was acting like I had died. I ignored it. Then the real emergency happened. My mom got sick. Nothing life-threatening, but bad enough that she needed help getting to doctor's appointments and running errands. My sister and brother both lived closer to her than I did. They both had flexible work schedules. Neither of them stepped up. Instead, my sister messaged me. Mom needed someone to take her to the doctor. She was really struggling. This was serious. I needed to stop whatever grudge I was holding and be there. I replied, "I'm not your backup plan anymore." It didn't take long for the group chat to blow up. The guilt tripping was immediate. My sister called me heartless. My brother, who had barely been involved in any of this, suddenly had an opinion. He told me I was making a point at the wrong time. My mom finally called me herself, voice shaky, saying she didn't think I would actually go through with it. The thing was, I didn't believe for a second that she had no one else. There were other family members, friends, neighbors. My siblings could have handled it, but they didn't want to. They just wanted me to step in, like always. I didn't. The next day, my dad called. He never called unless something was really wrong. For the first time, he admitted that yeah, maybe they had taken advantage of me over the years. But that's just how family works. I told him that wasn't how my family was going to work anymore. The extended family drama kicked off soon after. Some cousins, the ones who had ignored my birthday but expected me to pay for their wedding expenses, sent me paragraphs about how family is supposed to support each other. Others messaged privately, saying they actually understood why I was doing this. One cousin, who I barely spoke to, admitted he had been through something similar, always being the responsible one, always being the fallback plan. He said he was glad someone in the family was finally pushing back. Then my sister tried something new. She started talking to mutual family members, spinning it like I was making everything about myself, conveniently leaving out the part where I had covered her rent for 2 months when she was struggling. Or the times I footed the bill for unexpected expenses, she claimed she'd pay back. She complained that I had abandoned everyone, but was still expecting them to be there for me when I needed it, as if that had ever happened. Meanwhile, my life got better. Without the constant stress of family obligations, I had actual free time. Work was easier. I got more sleep. I started focusing on my hobbies again. My friends noticed, one even joked that I looked 10 years younger, now that I wasn't dealing with family drama every day. My mom must have sensed that I wasn't budging, because she tried another classic move, the dead relative guilt trip. If your grandma were alive, she'd be so disappointed in you. I left her on read. Then the betrayal happened. I came home from work one night and noticed something was off. Nothing was missing, but something felt wrong. I checked the locks. Everything seemed fine, but then, I saw a pair of shoes by the door, shoes that weren't mine. My brother had been inside my house. I found out later that my mom had given him a spare key without telling me, without asking. She had assumed, like always, that my boundaries didn't matter, that eventually I would come to my senses and welcome them back. It was a chilling realization. My own mother saw my home as something she still had control over, even after everything. Apparently, she thought that, eventually, I would come to my senses and let them back in, so she just decided to skip the part where I actually forgave them. I changed the locks the next day. My therapist, who I had just started seeing, didn't even seem surprised when I told her. She just nodded and said, "That's a serious boundary violation." She helped me put everything into perspective, how I had spent years bending over backward for people who saw me as nothing more than a safety net, how I had been conditioned to feel guilty for saying no. Meanwhile, my Reddit post about all of this had taken off. Hundreds of comments, people sharing similar stories, giving advice, offering support. Some even messaged me privately, telling me that reading my story helped them stand up to their own toxic families. A few even warned me to be careful financially, advising me to check my credit, my accounts, just in case. That got me thinking. I realized I wasn't even waiting for an apology anymore, because I knew it wouldn't come, and if it did, it wouldn't change anything. I didn't need their words. I needed peace, and if they wouldn't give it to me, I'd make it for myself. The silent treatment lasted longer than I expected. For weeks, nothing, no texts, no calls. The family group chat went dead, aside from the occasional forwarded meme or random message about a distant cousin's baby shower. It was obvious they were waiting for me to crack first. I didn't. Instead, my life got better. Without the constant pressure of last-minute favors, guilt tripping, or family drama, I had more energy. Work felt easier. I started waking up without the weight of obligation on my shoulders. My evenings were actually mine. No sudden calls demanding that I drop everything for someone else's problem. Then, my sister had another crisis. Her babysitter bailed on her again. Normally, she wouldn't even ask. She'd just assume I'd step in. But after the last time, she actually called. Desperate. She had an important meeting, no backup, and nowhere to turn. I told her I couldn't. That's when she snapped. She started yelling, saying that I was destroying this family and that I was selfish beyond words. She brought up my niece, acting like I was punishing a child just to prove a point. I hung up. An hour later, my mom called. I let it go to voicemail. The next day, a message popped up in the family group chat. "Maybe we have been asking too much of Alex." My mom had written it. It was the first time she had ever even slightly admitted fault. But before I could process it, my sister jumped in, furious. The moment she started crying about how hard things have been for her, my mom immediately backtracked. Family sticks together. Just like that, the moment of clarity was gone. That's when they tried a new tactic. The "we miss you" guilt trip. Vague messages started appearing in the chat. "It's not the same without you. Wish we could all be together again, like before." My cousin, the same one who called me heartless for not paying for his wedding expenses, wrote, "Time heals everything." Not one of them actually apologized. Then my dad messaged me privately. "Your mom wants you to come by for dinner. No drama, just to talk." I declined. Hours later, my mom sent a text. "Fine. If you won't come to us, we're coming to you." I replied, "I won't open the door." For the first time, they had no idea what to do with me. Meanwhile, my actual life, thriving. Without the constant distractions, I put more energy into work. A month later, I got a promotion, more money, more freedom. My friends noticed how much lighter I seemed. Even my boss jokingly asked if I had finally learned to relax. Then my sister started really reaching. She told extended family that I hated my niece, that I was punishing an innocent child just because I was holding a grudge. Word spread quickly, and suddenly relatives I hadn't talked to in years were messaging me, saying I was being too harsh. I sent one message back. "I don't hate my niece. I just won't be my sister's emergency solution anymore." No one had a response to that. Then, karma hit. The cousin's wedding. The same one I was guilt-tripped into funding. A total disaster. Half the family backed out last minute because of travel costs. The caterer pulled out due to non-payment. The venue charged them extra fees they didn't account for. I wasn't there, but I heard all about it. Then, out of nowhere, a message from my aunt. Not one of the toxic ones. A different one. Someone I had barely spoken to over the years. She told me she saw what was happening, that she understood, that she had been through the same thing but never had the courage to stand up for herself. "You're doing what I wish I did years ago." That stuck with me. My therapist had been saying the same thing, that my family didn't actually value me as a person. They only valued what I could do for them. And now that I wasn't playing their game anymore, they didn't know what to do. Then came the final proof. They started finding replacements. My brother, who barely lifted a finger before, was suddenly helping out more. My sister found new babysitters. My mom started asking my cousins for favors. For years, they acted like I was the only one who could handle things, like I was irreplaceable. But the second I stopped playing along, they adjusted. They survived. Then my mom sent one last message. "Do you even love us anymore?" I replied, "I love myself enough to stop letting you take advantage of me." Days later, another family emergency came up. For the first time ever, I did nothing, and they survived without me. The invitation came through a group text. "Come over for dinner, just to talk." It wasn't fooling anyone. I ignored it. A few hours later, another message popped up. My mom added a heart emoji this time, like that would change anything. When I didn't respond, my sister jumped in. "Wow, you've really changed." The next day, I found out what changed really meant. She started telling everyone that I was brainwashed by the internet. Apparently, I had been reading too many toxic posts and listening to strangers instead of family. She threw around words like selfish, manipulated, lost, and yet, in the middle of all this, my brother messaged me privately. For years, he had been the least involved, the most distant. But now, honestly, I get it, man. I hadn't expected that. He didn't defend anyone, didn't make excuses, just admitted that the way I was treated wasn't fair. Then, something even stranger happened. My dad, the one person who never took sides, called me. He spoke carefully, like he wasn't sure if he should be saying it out loud. "I don't agree with how your mother and sister treat you." For the first time, I realized he had always known. He just never did anything about it. That's when my mom finally broke. She called late at night, voice shaking, sobbing, asking how things got to this point. What did I do to deserve this? I told her the truth. She never showed up for me. She only reached out when she needed something. She treated me like a resource, not a son. Her response: "But that's just how family is." That was the moment I knew she'd never get it. Then my sister went even lower. She started digging, contacting old friends, even reaching out to my ex, looking for anything that would make me the problem. It didn't work. My ex ignored her. My friends laughed it off, but it proved something. This wasn't about family, this was about control. Meanwhile, the extended family started taking sides. Some aunts and uncles quietly messaged me, saying they understood, that they wished they could do what I was doing. Others were furious, saying I was tearing the family apart. Then my dad called again, but this time, there was no hesitation. "I think you're doing the right thing." It was the first time he had ever gone against my mom. And that's when she and my sister really started panicking, because they were losing control. Then my sister's financial crisis hit. Turns out, she relied on me more than she let on. Babysitting, help with bills, last-minute favors. Now that I wasn't there, she was struggling. And she expected me to fix it. She sent a long message about how she was trying her best, and how I was being cruel by abandoning them when they needed me most. I didn't respond. Then my mom sent one last message. "Please, just come home." It felt hollow, especially knowing that when I was there I had been their safety net, loaning money, paying for unexpected costs, and filling in whenever someone dropped the ball. But now that I was gone, they were struggling to find a new fallback plan. I asked, "Will anything actually change?" She didn't answer. That was all I needed to know. For the first time I felt free. No anger, no guilt, just peace. I sent one final message to the family group chat. "I love you all, but I won't be used anymore. If you ever want a real relationship, reach out, otherwise take care." And then I left the chat. A month passed, no messages, no last-minute emergencies, no guilt trips, silence. The family group chat, which had once been a constant source of passive-aggressive drama, had gone completely dead. No vague posts about certain people forgetting what family means. No fake attempts at reconciliation. Just nothing. Then my sister broke first. She posted a long emotional rant on Facebook about ungrateful family members who turn their backs on the people who raised them. The usual guilt-laced nonsense. She made it sound like she had been the victim, like she was struggling alone because someone abandoned her. Friends noticed immediately. Comments poured in, mostly from people who had no idea what was really going on. A few mutual friends messaged me, asking if everything was okay. I ignored it. A few days later, my mom changed tactics. She messaged me directly. No anger, no passive aggressiveness, just "I miss you so much. Can we just talk?" She was trying to sound warm, like the past few months hadn't happened, like she hadn't spent weeks calling me selfish, tearing me down to the rest of the family. I didn't respond. That's when my dad reached out. He had been silent through all of this, avoiding confrontation like he always did. But this time, his message was different. Your mom's been a wreck, but I think it's because she's finally realizing she pushed you too far. For once, he wasn't defending her. Meanwhile, my life had never been better. Work was smooth. I had more time for myself. No unexpected stress. No last-minute calls ruining my plans. Even my friends noticed how much lighter I seemed. Then, a message changed everything. My mom sent a text. A real one. I realize now that we've treated you unfairly. I want to fix this. No excuses. No blaming. Just that. I waited a while before replying. Then I kept it simple. I'm open to a real relationship, but I won't go back to being your safety net. Less than an hour later, my sister sent a text. She still wasn't apologizing. Instead, she was blaming me for dividing the family, saying that if I had just handled things differently, none of this would have happened. Some people never change. But my dad, he did. He started distancing himself from my mom's control. A few cousins and an aunt quietly did the same. They didn't make a big deal out of it, but I noticed. Then, my Reddit post blew up. People from all over shared similar stories, saying they had been in the same situation. Some said my story gave them the push they needed to set boundaries in their own lives. A few even shared legal advice, ways to make sure I was completely cut off from financial obligations to my family. Then, my mom tried one last guilt trip. Your grandma would be heartbroken if she saw this. I didn't hesitate. Then it's a good thing she isn't here to see how you treat me. That was the last time she tried manipulating me. Then, something unexpected happened. My dad asked if I wanted to get dinner. Just the two of us. No pressure. No family meeting. Just a meal. For the first time, I said yes. It was awkward at first. He wasn't great at emotional conversations, but he admitted it. He should have stood up for me sooner. He had let things happen because it was easier than fighting against my mom and sister. I didn't tell him I forgave him, but I didn't shut him out either. The next day, my mom sent one last message. I'll always be here when you're ready to apologize. I laughed to myself. I had nothing to apologize for, and for the first time, I didn't care what she thought. I was free. With me gone, my family needed a new scapegoat. It didn't take long for them to turn on each other. My sister, who had spent years expecting me to handle things for her, suddenly had a new complaint. Our brother. He never helped out. He never stepped up. She ranted to anyone who would listen about how unfair it was that she had to handle everything on her own now. Meanwhile, my mom started taking jabs at her too. She called her irresponsible and always needing money. The same thing she never had a problem with when I was the one covering for her. A cousin filled me in. Apparently, at every family gathering, my sister now spent half the time venting about how hard things had become since I cut contact. Babysitting, doctor's appointments, errands, her problem now. She was furious, and I couldn't help but notice. She never once thought to be grateful for all the years I did those things without question. Then my mom tried a different tactic. She started reaching out to distant relatives, spinning the story her way. According to her, I was going through a selfish phase. She told people I would snap out of it eventually, that one day I'd regret how I treated them. No one bought it, because my dad, he was starting to see through it all. The longer I stayed away, the more independent he became. He stopped playing mediator. He started pushing back when my mom tried to guilt trip him. Then my sister's real problem came to light. Without my constant help, she was struggling financially. She had no backup plan, no one to pick up the slack when things got tough. She reached out, but not directly. Instead of asking for money, she sent a casual message. Hey, do you miss your niece? It was bait. The same niece she once used to guilt me into babysitting. The same niece she tried to weaponize when I set boundaries. I ignored it. A week later, my cousin messaged me. There had been a big family gathering, a birthday dinner for my mom. I wasn't invited, which was fine, but apparently, that didn't stop them from making the night about me. Half the dinner was spent talking about me, complaining about how I chose to cut myself off, and how it's so sad he's doing this to himself. The best part, not one of them had reached out before the dinner. Not to invite me, not to check in, nothing. Then my mom tried something new. She called, but this time, she acted like everything was fine. No guilt tripping, no anger, just a casual, sweet tone. I just wanted to check in on you, honey. Like nothing had ever happened. Like she hadn't spent months playing victim, attacking me online and telling family members I was going through a phase. No apology, no accountability, just fishing for control. I kept my response simple. I'm doing great, Mom. Hope you are too. Then I hung up. No arguments. No drama. Just peace. She wasn't used to that. The next day, my sister tried to get my dad involved. She demanded he talk some sense into me. Make me come to dinner. His response? If he doesn't want to, that's his choice. That was the moment I knew everything had shifted. Meanwhile, my career took off. Without constant stress, I was able to focus. I got a raise. I started dating again. I realized how much lighter life felt when I wasn't constantly waiting for the next guilt trip. Then my mom made her final move. She sent a long text. Dramatic. Full of emotional weight. You'll regret this when I'm gone. I didn't even respond. Instead, I checked my Reddit inbox. A stranger had messaged me. Your story gave me the courage to set boundaries with my toxic family too. And then my dad called again. For the first time, he admitted it outright. I should have spoken up sooner. Your mom steamrolls over everyone. That was all I needed to hear. And my mom, my sister, they made their final decision too. They stopped reaching out. Not because they had changed, not because they understood, but because they had decided, fine, let's act like he doesn't exist. But here's the thing. It's not a punishment if I prefer it that way. And now, my life is better than ever. Months of silence. Then, out of nowhere, hey, I miss you. It was from my mom. No context. No apology. Just an attempt to act like everything was normal again. I didn't reply. A few days later, my sister tried her own version. So do you just not care about us anymore? I sent back one line. I care about people who respect me. She didn't respond after that. Then, my dad texted. Unlike the others, he didn't guilt trip me. He just admitted it. Your mom is struggling with this, but I get why you stepped away. The next day, the family group chat lit up for the first time in months. They were planning a holiday gathering, no mention of the past. No discussion about what happened, just an expectation that I'd fold and show up. For a second, I actually considered it, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I wanted to see if anything had actually changed. I decided to go. Not as the old version of myself, the one who said yes to everything, who let himself be guilt-tripped into favors and obligations. I was going as someone with firm boundaries. The moment I walked in, my mom greeted me like nothing had ever happened. She hugged me, acted warm, smiled too much. But within minutes, the passive-aggressive comments started. So, are you done with your little rebellion now? I ignored it. Then, my sister made her move. She barely waited 10 minutes before asking me to watch her kid while she grabbed something real quick. Nothing had changed, not even a little. I finished my food, made some small talk, and stood up. My mom blinked. My sister frowned. The entire room went quiet. Wait, you're leaving already? I smiled. Yeah, I have plans. The shock on their faces was almost funny. As I grabbed my coat, my mom tried one last attempt. Next time, stay longer. I just said, we'll see. Translation. If you act right, maybe. That night, my dad texted, proud of you. You handled that well. The next day, my sister started complaining to relatives. He barely stayed. It's like he doesn't even care. One of my cousins shut it down immediately. Maybe he's just done being used. And that was the moment I knew. If they ever truly changed, I was open to reconnecting. But if not, I was happier than I had ever been. Weeks passed. No texts. No guilt trips. No last-minute emergencies. For the first time in my life, my family wasn't pulling me back in. It was almost peaceful. Then, my dad did something unexpected. He reached out, not to fix things, not to mediate, but just to talk. There was no mention of my sister, no pressure to see my mom, just a quiet admission. Your mom's still mad, but I get it. Something had changed in him. He wasn't trying to pull me back into the cycle. He wasn't defending anyone. He was just talking. Meanwhile, my sister's life was falling apart. She had burned through her savings. The people she used to rely on were backing away, realizing she expected too much. I half expected her to reach out with an apology, some hint of self-awareness. But instead, she doubled down, complaining to anyone who would listen about how I had abandoned her, still refusing to see how much I had done for her in the past. One cousin told me she'd snapped at a family gathering, ranting about how everyone had abandoned her, that she was the only one holding things together. No one rushed to fix things for her. Then, one day, my mom actually said it. I shouldn't have treated you like that. The words I never thought I'd hear. I thanked her, but I didn't rush to say everything was fine. Years of damage don't disappear overnight. My sister overheard. So what? You'll forgive her but not me. I just looked at her. You've never even apologized. She had no response. Meanwhile, my dad kept evolving. He started making plans with me. Just us. No mother, no sister, no forced family unity. For the first time, it felt like we actually had a relationship that wasn't built on guilt or obligation. And me, I was thriving. Work was better than ever. I traveled. I started dating someone who actually respected my boundaries. No manipulation, no guilt, just real effort on both sides. Then, the family gossip started unraveling. Relatives who once blamed me were starting to see it. They realized I wasn't the problem. My mom and sister were. My sister's relationship hit a wall. Her own boyfriend started noticing how toxic she was. He pulled away. She went from complaining about me to everyone in her life. And for the first time, no one came running to fix it. Then, something else changed. My mom stopped expecting things from me. She still texted sometimes, but never to ask for favors. No guilt trips. No passive-aggressive comments. One day, my dad said something simple. I'm glad you stood up for yourself. That was the real closure. Not an apology, not some grand reconciliation. Just the quiet realization that I wasn't wrong for setting boundaries. And my mom, she never fully admitted it, but her actions said everything. She had pushed me away, expecting me to come back, but I never needed them as much as they needed me. Family should be about love and support, not obligation and control. And I never went back to being their doormat. And I never will again. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and to put it simply, My family wasn't around much when I was struggling, but now that I'm doing well, they suddenly seem to be everywhere. This dynamic has been there for as long as I can remember, but I guess I didn't fully understand it until recently. Growing up, I always felt that I was on my own. My family wasn't exactly supportive of my interests, my ambitions, or anything that didn't line up with their expectations. My dad was a practical guy, and that meant that any dreams I had that didn't lead to an immediate paycheck were a waste of time. I was pretty serious about art in high school, loved to draw and paint, and I'd talk about studying it in college. But every time I brought it up, the reaction was the same, a lecture about how I'd be better off doing something useful instead of chasing rainbows. So I decided not to bother them with what I wanted. I'd keep my art supplies hidden and only work on my projects late at night. That was how it was until I moved out, which was another story on its own. I managed to get into a decent college, and leaving home was a huge relief. Finally, I thought I'd get some space to figure out what I wanted to do without my family breathing down my neck. But moving out also meant zero support from them. They didn't offer to help with tuition, didn't help me move, and didn't even offer advice on how to handle things on my own. They just made it clear that since I was an adult now, I'd have to handle everything myself. They didn't say it directly, but the message was clear: you're on your own. To support myself, I got a part-time job at a coffee shop. The pay wasn't great, and I had to work late hours just to make ends meet, but I kept going. Balancing work and studies was tough, but I pushed through. The idea of asking my family for help never even crossed my mind, because I already knew the answer. Even when I had days where I'd be too exhausted to keep my eyes open in class, I'd get through it, knowing that I couldn't count on anyone else. And it wasn't like they were checking in on me anyway. Every once in a while, my family would call or message, but these weren't the "how are you doing" kind of check-ins. Instead, they'd want to know what I was doing to make money, and more often than not, bring up the fact that they'd spent all those years raising me, feeding me, and housing me. My dad, in particular, would throw in lines like, "It's only right you pay it back someday." The idea of paying my own parents for raising me, I didn't know if that was normal, but it never sat right with me. Things continued this way through college, with me hustling just to keep my head above water. I got really lucky with some amazing friends who became my support system. They were like the family I'd always wanted, people who actually cared if I was okay. These friends became my chosen family, and honestly, they were the only reason I got through some of the worst times. When I had a health scare during my junior year, it was my friends who took me to the hospital, stayed with me, and helped me recover. My own family? They didn't even return my calls until days later, and when they did, it was just to tell me that I'd need to learn how to handle these things on my own. After college, I started working in my field. It took some time, but I worked my way up, and recently I've landed a stable job with decent pay. I've been able to save up, even splurge on a few things, and I finally feel like I have a handle on my life. It was a big moment for me, something I felt proud of because I got here on my own. But then, out of nowhere, my family started reaching out. My mom called, my dad sent a couple of messages, and even my siblings who I hadn't heard from in months suddenly wanted to catch up. They all kept saying how proud they were of me and how great it was that I'd made it. It felt a little strange, honestly, like they were too enthusiastic, considering we'd hardly spoken in recent years. But I didn't think too much about it until they started hinting at how it would be nice if I could help them out now that I was doing so well. At first, I brushed it off. They didn't ask outright, so I thought maybe I was just reading too much into things. But the hints started coming up in every conversation, and they became less and less subtle. My dad would say things like, "It's only right to give back to the people who made you who you are." And my mom would talk about how my siblings were struggling and could use some help. It became clear they weren't just calling to reconnect. They wanted something. Now, I find myself in this weird position. I know they're my family, and part of me feels like maybe I should be helping. But at the same time, I can't ignore the fact that I got to this point on my own. They weren't there for the sleepless nights, the endless hours of work, or the times when I didn't know if I'd even make it through the month. I'm proud of where I am, and I don't want to feel guilty about it. All of this has left me feeling torn. On the one hand, they're family. On the other, I can't shake the feeling that I'm only valuable to them now that I'm useful. And honestly, I don't know if I'm being selfish or if their expectations are just unfair. Update 1. So things picked up right after my family's subtle hints about me helping them out. It didn't take long for those hints to turn into full-blown demands. The first big one came from my mom, asking if I could cover some repairs for their house. She explained how the roof had a leak and there were plumbing issues piling up. It was framed as though I'd be doing them a favor, but there was a heavy undertone suggesting it was my responsibility. I listened, but when I said I couldn't help, she immediately shifted her tone. I explained that I'd been putting money aside for a personal project I'd been working toward for years. I kept it simple, saying it wasn't personal, I was just being practical. But that didn't go over well. Suddenly I was hearing about how selfish I'd become, how I was letting success go to my head, and even how I'd forgotten where I came from. She didn't hold back, throwing in that my siblings had sacrificed plenty and could have been successful too if they'd had the same luck I did. The very next day, I started getting messages from my siblings. My sister called, and instead of the usual small talk, she went straight to how she was struggling to keep up with her bills. She hinted that with my extra cash, maybe I could step in to help her out, just this once. My brother chimed in with his own financial issues not long after, mentioning how he'd hit a rough patch and could really use a loan to get back on his feet. I told them that I couldn't help, and just like with my mom, they got upset. They said I'd changed, that I thought I was too good for them now, and kept bringing up how they'd supported me while growing up. It was like this avalanche of blame, and suddenly everyone had their own version of the story, where I was the bad guy who'd forgotten his family. One of my friends noticed I was stressed, so I told him what was happening. He didn't seem surprised and just said, "You need to set some boundaries." That sounded easier said than done. I didn't know how to tell my family that their expectations were too much without it turning into a huge family feud. Plus, they weren't the kind of people who took no easily. My mom kept calling, and every time it was something new. She'd bring up the sacrifices she'd made, reminding me of all the things she and my dad had done to raise me right. She kept saying that it was only fair I helped now that I had made it. After several calls like this, I finally tried to explain where I was coming from. I told her how hard it had been to get here, how I'd managed on my own without much help, and that I needed to prioritize my own goals right now. But she wasn't having it. She twisted it into a loyalty test, implying that if I truly cared about the family, I'd step up. The whole conversation ended with her sounding disappointed, as if I'd failed some big family test. The pressure didn't stop. My uncle reached out to check in, but it was obvious he was just fishing for more information on my financial situation. He talked about how family sticks together and how it's important for everyone to contribute to keep the family afloat. Then he hinted that if everyone pitched in, it would make things easier for those who were struggling, meaning my siblings. It was like this subtle push that I should be contributing a regular amount to help everyone out. This was where things started to mess with my head. My friend noticed again, and this time he didn't just suggest boundaries. He practically insisted, telling me that this cycle would keep going unless I stood firm. He'd seen similar things happen with people close to him, and warned me that once family sees someone as a provider, they don't just stop asking. It was reassuring, but I still felt torn. Part of me thought maybe they were right, that I did owe them something. Then, out of nowhere, my mom sent me a message with an actual number. She suggested I contribute a percentage of my income monthly to help out with the family expenses. She made it sound reasonable, like it was just a small percentage, and that I'd hardly notice it. I didn't respond right away, but I felt this weight settling in. They weren't just hinting or asking for one-time help anymore. They were setting terms like I was some kind of a TM. I tried to avoid their calls after that. The pressure was too much, and I didn't know how to handle it. But they didn't give up. My sister started posting vague messages online about how families should support each other, implying that some people don't understand that. I knew exactly who it was aimed at, and it didn't take long for a few relatives to reach out to me, asking if everything was okay. It felt like my family was building a narrative to make me look like the one in the wrong. The last straw came when my mom brought up some old grievances. She reminded me of things from years ago, small incidents blown out of proportion, and hinted that my success was a debt I owed the family. It was like a trap I couldn't get out of. No matter what I did, it felt like I was never doing enough. My siblings joined in, echoing the same complaints, adding to this picture that I was too good for everyone now. I'm honestly not sure where to go from here. It feels like every time I try to set any kind of limit, it only fuels their frustration. Part of me wonders if I'm being unreasonable, or if this is just how family is supposed to be. But it's exhausting, and no matter what I do, they keep finding new ways to make me feel like I'm failing them. Update 2. Not long after the family started making demands for regular contributions, I logged into Facebook one morning and saw a post from my mom. It was one of those vague, passive-aggressive posts that you just know is about you, even if it doesn't mention your name. She wrote something along the lines of, "It's heartbreaking when those you've sacrificed everything for turn their backs once they've made it big. Family is supposed to stick together, not forget where they come from." I sat there staring at the screen, stunned. It felt like a punch to the gut. She didn't have to name me, everyone knew who she was talking about. It wasn't just the words, but the dozens of comments from extended family and even a few of my siblings, all chiming in to agree, liking and hearting the post, some even tagging me in their replies. My cousin commented, "Family helps each other. No excuses." My aunt jumped in with, "Some people think success makes them better than the rest of us." Soon after, my phone started buzzing with messages from friends who'd seen the post. A few of them reached out, telling me to ignore the comments and reminding me how hard I'd worked to get where I am. They were supportive, saying that my family's reaction wasn't fair and that I didn't owe anyone anything. Even though it helped to have their support, the whole situation weighed heavily on me. I couldn't believe my own family was making a public spectacle out of this. Then came the messages from other relatives. Some called to ask if everything was okay and tried to stay neutral. But others had clearly picked a side, telling me that it wasn't right to leave my family hanging and that I should be more grateful. The divide in the family started to become really obvious. One of my younger siblings, who I'd always been close to, reached out privately to say they understood my side and didn't agree with our parents. But another sibling jumped right into the mess, backing up my mom's post with comments about how I'd changed and turned my back on family. Things escalated when I was invited to a family gathering not long after. I debated skipping it, but I didn't want to make things worse by not showing up. As soon as I arrived, though, I regretted coming. The atmosphere was tense, and every conversation seemed to have a double meaning. My mom made a point to talk about how difficult things had been lately, how everyone was struggling, and how it was sad when people chose to forget their responsibilities. Other relatives nodded in agreement, casting glances in my direction. It was as if they'd rehearsed it. Every attempt I made to change the topic was redirected back to how family helps family. Even my uncle, who rarely ever spoke to me growing up, suddenly had plenty to say about how successful people had an obligation to lift up the rest. Every eye in the room turned to me, waiting for a response, but I just nodded and tried to stay polite. But then, the comments got worse. One relative hinted that if I wasn't going to help the family, maybe it was better if I didn't attend family gatherings at all. Someone else added that family unity was more important than any individual's success, and if I wasn't on board, maybe it was better to keep my distance. I felt like I was being put on trial, with everyone in the room sizing me up as if they had a say in how I spent my money and lived my life. After the gathering, my partner noticed how drained I was and sat me down. They'd been incredibly supportive through everything but could see the toll it was taking on me. They pointed out that my family's behavior was crossing every boundary and that this wasn't normal or healthy. A few of my close friends said the same thing. They were all worried that the constant pressure was starting to wear me down, and they were right. In the days that followed, I realized how much my family's demands were affecting my mental health and even my finances. Every time they reached out, I'd feel this knot in my stomach, dreading what they'd ask for next. The whole situation was eating away at the pride I'd felt in my accomplishments. What was the point of all the work I'd done if it only led to this? My family's next move was an ultimatum. My mom called, saying it was time to decide if I was truly a part of the family or if I was only looking out for myself. She went on about how, if I didn't step up and start supporting the family like I was supposed to, they'd stop inviting me to family events. It felt like blackmail, as if they were dangling the idea of family over my head, expecting me to jump through hoops to keep it. It was overwhelming, but it also marked a turning point for me. I started reflecting on everything I'd sacrificed to get to where I was. The long nights, the sacrifices, the setbacks I'd faced alone. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't responsible for my family's choices, and that if I kept giving in, they'd never stop asking for more. I decided to set firmer boundaries, though the thought of the backlash made me nervous. I realized that I'd never feel free or at peace if I kept letting them control me this way. After speaking with my partner and friends, I knew that I couldn't keep letting my family drain me, financially and emotionally. With a deep breath, I drafted a message to my mom, laying out some clear boundaries. I explained that I couldn't keep giving in to their demands and that I needed to focus on my own life and goals. I kept it respectful but firm, knowing this was my chance to take back control. Hitting send was terrifying, and I knew there would be fallout. But at that moment, I was done. It was time to start looking out for myself, no matter how they reacted. Update 3. After I sent that message to my mom, things got quiet, too quiet. It lasted maybe a week before everything blew up again, but this time they took it to a whole new level. My mom called, and this time she was direct. She asked me to provide a breakdown of my finances, monthly income, savings, and even my investments. She framed it as a way for them to understand how much help I could realistically offer. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was such a blatant request, like I was some bank they could audit to see how much they could withdraw. I told her, flat out, that my finances were private. I explained that I worked hard to earn that money and that I didn't owe anyone details about how much I made or where it was going. She didn't take it well. She called me secretive and untrustworthy, saying that if I didn't have anything to hide, I wouldn't mind sharing. She kept implying that I was keeping secrets, and even said something about how it would bring peace to the family if they all knew what I had. It was baffling and invasive. I ended the call before it could go any further. But that didn't stop them. Not long after, one of my siblings jumped in. My brother messaged me, echoing what my mom had said about how full transparency was just part of being a family. He kept insisting that if I had nothing to hide, then sharing my financial situation should be easy. I could almost see the pressure mounting, and soon I started getting texts and calls from other family members, cousins, aunts, even an uncle who barely ever spoke to me. They were all saying things like family means honesty and loyalty means being open. My family started throwing guilt trips from every direction. They'd remind me about sacrifices they'd supposedly made for me, even bringing up things that had happened years ago, like paying for my school clothes or my childhood sports fees. They made it sound like I owed them for everything I had, and the only way to repay them was by opening up my finances and helping them out. The message was clear. If I didn't contribute to their struggles, I was nothing more than a stranger to them. Then, things got worse. My sister made a vague post on social media. It didn't mention my name directly, but anyone who knew us would know exactly who she was talking about. It read something like, "Some people forget their roots as soon as they make it big. It's sad when family is left behind by the people they helped raise." The comments poured in, and it was clear they all believed her side. She kept it vague enough to avoid direct backlash, but obvious enough to let everyone know I was the bad guy here. Seeing that post was humiliating. Friends who saw it started reaching out, asking if everything was okay. One of my closest friends bluntly told me that this was getting out of hand and advised me to go no contact for a while. He said that as long as I kept giving in or responding, they'd only keep escalating their demands. It sounded extreme, but he was right. I couldn't keep this up forever. As if the social media posts weren't bad enough, my family started finding new ways to drag my name through the mud. One of them actually called my office, talking to my boss and dropping my name to try and get some benefits for themselves. They'd never done anything like this before, and I was floored. My boss called me in to talk about it, and I could see the confusion on his face. I apologized and tried to brush it off as a family misunderstanding, but I knew this was just a new low they were willing to reach. At this point, I knew I couldn't just let it go. I tried to confront my family about it directly. I called my mom and explained, as calmly as I could, that this behavior was not okay and that calling my workplace was crossing a serious line. She dismissed it, saying I was being dramatic and that I should be proud they were trying to show me off at my job. It was as if she couldn't understand why this was wrong or why it was causing so much stress. Then came their next demand. My mom messaged me saying that to keep things fair and supportive, they thought it was reasonable for me to contribute a set amount of my monthly income to the family. They'd even come up with a name for it, a family support fund. It felt like they were trying to make it sound noble, but the whole thing was absurd. They weren't asking for help, they were expecting it, like it was my duty to fund their lives. This whole mess had gotten so overwhelming that I didn't know what to believe anymore. I started questioning if I was the one in the wrong here. Was it selfish to keep my finances private? Was it really that bad to set boundaries? I couldn't make sense of any of it, so I decided to seek out help. I booked a session with a therapist to work through everything. It was my first time going and I was hesitant, but I needed an outside perspective. During that session, I explained what had been going on, the demands, the guilt trips, the way they'd made my success feel like a debt. The therapist listened and pointed out patterns I hadn't noticed before. She talked about setting boundaries, saying that it wasn't selfish or wrong to protect my own peace and financial stability. Hearing that from a professional helped me see things more clearly. Leaving that session, I felt more determined. I couldn't keep letting my family treat me this way. They were crossing every boundary, and if I didn't take a stand now, it would only get worse. I knew they'd react badly, but for the first time, I felt like I had the strength to stick to my decision. I was ready to protect myself, no matter what kind of backlash it brought. Update 4. After that first therapy session, I started seeing things more clearly. The therapist helped me understand what was happening. She called it a boundary issue, and she explained that people who struggle to respect boundaries will often lash out when they don't get what they want. She talked about manipulative behaviors and how guilt could be used as a weapon to control someone. Hearing that from someone outside my circle was eye-opening, and it made me realize that protecting myself wasn't selfish. So I decided it was time to set some real boundaries with my family. I told my family that from now on, my finances were off limits. I wouldn't be discussing money with them, and I definitely wouldn't be contributing to any family support fund. I explained that I needed to focus on my own goals and that while I'd always care for them, I wasn't going to be their financial safety net. I made it clear that I had a right to keep my hard-earned money for myself. I thought approaching it respectfully would help, but my family's response was explosive. Within hours, I was bombarded with angry messages and missed calls. My mom accused me of abandoning the family and claimed that I was being influenced by outsiders who didn't understand true family loyalty. She kept saying that I'd changed and that I wasn't the person she had raised. A few of my siblings reached out too, each trying to play peacemaker, but even their messages had a certain edge. They implied that I owed it to them to help out, as if my success was something we all owned. One of them even said that therapy was brainwashing me into being selfish and that I was letting people get into my head. I stood firm, but that only seemed to fuel their anger. My mom started calling my close friends, hoping they'd talk some sense into me. She tried to convince them that I was going down the wrong path and that the family needed me. When that didn't work, she reached out to my partner, trying to spin the story as if I was being unreasonable and unfair. My partner was furious. They told me that it was unfair for my family to drag them into the mess and suggested that if things kept going like this, maybe I should consider going no contact, at least temporarily. The situation kept escalating. My family issued an ultimatum. They told me that if I didn't act like part of the family by contributing financially, I'd be cut off from all family events. They were trying to make it clear that they'd no longer consider me a part of the family unless I started giving in to their demands. I brought this up in my next therapy session, and my therapist reminded me that these ultimatums were just another form of manipulation. She reassured me that setting boundaries wasn't wrong, no matter how much backlash I received. It was empowering, but it also left me wondering if I should just step back from them altogether for a while. Meanwhile, my siblings started posting even more on social media. One post read, "Some people forget who was there for them when they had nothing," with comments agreeing that family should come first. Another sibling shared loyalty and gratitude are everything. Some folks just don't get it. They were vague enough to avoid outright accusations, but clear enough that people who knew us would understand who they were targeting. It felt like I was being painted as the villain in their story. After all the social media posts and angry messages started dying down, I noticed a strange calm in my life. Without the constant pressure, the calls, and the guilt trips, I felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, I had a sense of peace and clarity. My friends noticed too, saying I looked less stressed, like a weight had been lifted. It was a strange realization that maybe, just maybe, I didn't need my family's approval to feel fulfilled. But just as I was beginning to adjust to the quiet, my family made one last push. They sent a long, heartfelt message as a group text, filled with nostalgic memories from when I was a kid, family vacations, birthday parties, little things that would tug at my heartstrings. They talked about how much they missed those times and how they just wanted us all to be close again. It was a message crafted to pull at my guilt, like a final attempt to get me to give in. I read it over, feeling the familiar pang of obligation and guilt creeping back in, but I knew what they were doing. They weren't reaching out to reconnect. They were trying to get me to go back to being the provider they'd made me out to be. This was just another way to pressure me, hidden under layers of sentimentality and shared memories. In that moment, I decided to hold firm. I responded, acknowledging the memories and saying that I'd always care for them as family, but that I was done with the financial expectations and manipulative tactics. I made it clear that I wouldn't be swayed by guilt anymore and that, for my own well-being, I'd be keeping my distance if these tactics continued. After that, things finally went quiet. I wasn't sure if it was acceptance or just another calm before the storm, but for now I had my boundaries set. I'd spent years working to build a stable life for myself, and I deserved the peace that came with it. I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Update 5. After setting those final boundaries with my family, I thought maybe things would finally calm down. But of course, it didn't end there. A few days later, I saw yet another post from my mom on Facebook, but this time it was even more direct. She wrote something like, "Some people forget the sacrifices that were made for them. If they refuse to help family, maybe it's time everyone knew the truth." The comments were a mix of sympathy and outrage, with relatives and family friends chiming in, clearly on her side. It felt like an open threat, as if they were gearing up to spread a one-sided story, making me out to be the ungrateful son who turned his back on family. When I showed it to my friends, they were furious. One of them even joked, if they want to tell the truth, then maybe it's time we posted some receipts of our own. My partner encouraged me to ignore it, saying that their behavior just proved how unreasonable they were being. They reminded me that I deserved to live my life without being guilted at every turn. This was a painful turning point for me. Seeing my family willing to go public to shame me felt like the final blow, but it also brought a new kind of clarity. I realized that their love had always seemed conditional, based on how much they could get from me rather than who I was. It hurt, but it was also liberating in a strange way. I understood, maybe for the first time, that I didn't owe them anything beyond basic respect and love. Not my time, not my money, and certainly not my mental health. I decided to cut back even further on contact. I sent occasional updates to let them know I was okay, but that was it. I wouldn't be engaging in financial discussions or anything that hinted at money. If they brought it up, I'd shut it down or simply ignore it. Predictably, they didn't take it well. My siblings started messaging me again, each with their own crisis that only I could help solve. One had a sudden car problem, another was struggling to pay bills. They framed each message as though I was abandoning them in their time of need. The next time my mom posted something on social media about family unity, I decided to respond with one calm comment. I said that while I respected everyone's perspective, I needed to focus on my own well-being, and that people often only see one side of the story. It wasn't confrontational, just a reminder that things weren't as black and white as they made it seem. Surprisingly, the post went quiet after that. I think people could see there was more to the story than my family was letting on. My therapy sessions helped me hold steady. Every time I started feeling guilty, my therapist reminded me that boundaries were necessary and that saying no wasn't wrong, especially when the demands were unreasonable. Therapy taught me to recognize patterns in my family's behavior and to stay grounded in my decisions. Each session strengthened my resolve, and I finally felt like I was building a life on my own terms. About a month later, my mom reached out with a different tone. She sent a long message saying that she understood and that maybe they'd been too hard on me, but there was still a hint that I should keep them in mind in case they ever really needed me. I thanked her but kept my distance, knowing this was likely another attempt to regain control. My family wasn't just going to give up on the idea that I'd keep helping them forever, even if it meant changing their approach. Surprisingly, a few distant relatives reached out as well, but not in the way I expected. They shared stories of their own struggles with family pressure, saying they'd gone through something similar and assuring me I'd done the right thing. One of my cousins even admitted they'd been avoiding family functions for years because of the constant guilt trips. Knowing I wasn't alone in this made it easier to stay firm in my boundaries. Eventually, my family started acting like things were back to normal. My mom started talking about how proud she was of me again, as if nothing had happened. My siblings kept their distance but sent the occasional "hope you're well" text, keeping things polite and casual. It was as if they were testing to see if they could draw me back in without bringing up the financial aspect. But I knew better than to drop my guard. I kept my responses brief and didn't let the conversations get too personal. Without the constant demands and guilt trips, my life improved. Financially, I felt more secure than ever, able to plan for my future without worrying about unexpected family contributions. I started setting bigger goals, finally considering things I'd put off for years. It felt like I'd broken free from a heavy chain, and I could actually focus on what I wanted, not what everyone else expected from me. My partner noticed the difference too. They told me how much they appreciated my strength in standing up for my own peace, and how proud they were of me. It brought us closer together, knowing we could face challenges as a team, and that they truly supported my decisions. As time went on, I kept attending therapy. It helped me process the impact of everything that had happened and made me realize just how much I'd been holding on to out of guilt and obligation. Therapy showed me that it was okay to choose myself and that my happiness didn't have to depend on meeting anyone else's expectations. In the end, I decided that while I'd always loved my family, I couldn't let them take advantage of my success. I'd worked hard to get where I was, and I finally had the courage to protect what I'd earned. Choosing my own peace over their demands was one of the hardest, but most freeing decisions I'd ever made. And for the first time, I felt truly in control of my life.